Hello, and welcome back to Vox Popcast, the weekly pseudo-academic roundtable of pop culture analysis with drinking and swearing. My name is Christopher Maverick, but you can call me Mav, and I am once again here with my co-hosts, Katya and Wayne. How's it going, guys?
Mav.
Oregon is on fire, but not in the place where I'm at, so that's nice.
That's good.
Congratulations.
Silver lining, I guess.
Yeah.
Apparently, although the smoke apparently has made it to the East Coast.
Yes. Yeah.
So, sorry, y'all.
Yeah, from what I've seen, enough of the West Coast is on fire that like they are experiencing it all the way on the other. Yeah, it's crazy, but you know.
So it's also the smoke is blowing away from where I live, so that's nice.
Yes.
I've got haze in Utah, so
we had haze here in Pittsburgh from Canadian forest fires. So
yeah, we should also point out. So the voice you didn't recognize, that's also Andrew Darowski, producer Andrew, as he calls himself, of the Protagonist podcast,
as Joe calls me.
Well, you've been here enough times that I think you're very much in the, you know, you don't have to wait to be in introduced guest phase anymore. So Andrew's here joining us.
We have a flow chart that determines that status. It's a very important trade secret.
There's a complicated ranking system.
There's a point system. There's modifiers. You know
what happens if you're a new guest? You're just too uncomfortable to speak until one of us address you. But once you've been here for a while, people just barge in. So, you know, it's fine.
For a while. Maybe you've been on the show, you've spoken on the show for more than 4 minutes and realized that.
Yeah. We are,
like,
yes.
This is just the show. Talking over each other is the show.
It is.
Is there like a level of sitcom guest where when they walk in the door, someone doesn't have to say their name? Like they've been a frequent enough guest that they don't need the introduction?
That's what happened to Hannah.
We need to have that sitcom cheer whenever our guests come on. You need to put that
Yeah, I guess I can. Well, let's see. If I thought about it, I just edited it in now.
Yeah.
And I think I'm going to leave myself saying that.
Future Mav follows current Mav's directions. I feel like future Mav, much like current Mav, does not like to be told what to do. So I will watch. I will listen with anticipation to see whether or not future Mav will listen.
Does it count as telling myself what to do when it's me telling myself? I don't know.
I think it does.
Yeah,
you'll be a different person like 5 days from now when you're edited.
So anyway, I it's kind of weird. This is the second show in a row, I think. I'm not sure because I sometimes lose track of when we record versus when episodes come out. But last week's show was the alcohol show, which was, you know, one of our regular normal guests. That was Marone Langsner. He proposed that one. He's like, you guys should do a show on this. And I was like, well, why don't you come on and do a show on this? and it was like, sure. And, you know, he got some guests there. So this is another one of those weeks where, you know, we've got like some topics and I randomly get a text message from Andrew one day saying, you know, this isn't right for my show, but it's perfect for your show. You guys should do this. And I was like, yeah, you should. And he goes, well, I'd like to be on. And I was like, oh, you're going to be on if we're doing this. So
you suggested show. You are voluntary.
Kind of my go-to approach is like, you guys should do this thing and invite me on. I think it might be like my little brother syndrome, where it's like, but can I be included since it was my idea? Can I also do it?
Oh, we now have 5 hosts of the show, and you know one of the big ways that the most recent two who aren't here, the 3 of us were here at the beginning. The two newer ones is like, oh no, you've had too many ideas. You have to do work now. That's how both Hannah and Monica got.
You have a complicated flow chart, which we keep secret from even the new hosts.
You're officially on staff.
Yep. So anyway,
we don't pay because there are no rewards in this business.
The highly you know, innovative and crazy, you know, high profile world of internet podcasting.
Yeah, it's like freemium gaming, but in reverse.
Internet podcasting on the academic circuit, you know.
Yeah.
So classy. which Andrew you're familiar with. But
anyway, what are we talking about?
What are we talking about? It's your idea because this is actually based on one of your two other shows, but also more so.
Yeah. So the like main crux of the idea is something that came up as my wife Kester and I, who I think Kester's been on here before.
Yes, Kester's only come on once. She was a guest once, and I believe there's been like once or twice where we've done like game shows, and she has laughed at you derisively from the background.
Something like that, probably.
A cameo, at least.
But so we're working on our Movies by Minutes podcast where we dissect Disney movies 1 minute at a time. And we're about to do 101 Dalmatians. And so we've been doing a bunch of research for it. And there is a particular sequence that kind of like sparked this idea. I mean, a little bit of like the entire second half of the film has got me thinking about like Holocaust narratives. I was like, okay, you can read the Dalmatians hiding from Cruella de Vil and her henchmen and trying to sneak through the countryside. You can look at all of that and see kind of like the shadows of Holocaust literature, like Mouse or something, where it's like, okay, they're hiding. The Nazis are looking for their lives are in danger. And so you can see that kind of narrative structure. And then there's a specific sequence in there where, and Kestra is the one who's done like most of the research. She's listened to the other Disney podcasts talk about this movie. She's read the blogs and everything. And a lot of them are like, oh yeah, like 101 Dalmatians is pretty great, except for that blackface sequence. And I was like, she mentioned that to me. I was like, what blackface sequence? Are they talking about the part where they're hiding from Cruella so they get covered in soot so they can pass as Labradors? Is that blackface? And I was suddenly like confronted with the idea of this other reading that in my mind, like that sequence in particular, like Cruella's looking through the window and trying to spot them. I'm like, that's like Anne Frank in the walls and Nazis are in the house kind of stuff. And then there's this like cultural context. I was like, yeah. And then this blackface sequence really ruins my viewing of this movie. I was like, I didn't think of that as blackface at all, but I guess it totally is in a way. Like like they're getting covered in soot and they're passing as different dogs. So like, it's not performative blackface, but like, okay, functionally. Yeah. And so originally I had like messaged Mav to talk about that. And so Mav is eventually going to be our guest for that because I know Mav can talk about it in a way that's just not, it's not just blackface. This movie's bad. This is evil and terrible. Now Mav can like discuss blackface with nuance. Yeah. Mav is capable of that, as are people on this show. And so it ultimately got me thinking about different things. And someone had mentioned like Underground Railroad. I was like, oh, I got Holocaust, but I could see how someone would get Underground Railroad for the Dalmatians escaping. And so long story short, the idea is there's multiple readings of a lot of things in media, right? A lot of different texts. You can say, oh, I see this kind of motif or that kind of motif, and people can have different readings. And the motif is like the text is the same. So how do you parse validity of readings or contradictory readings or interpretations? And how do you compare that to intention and meaning? But also sometimes the author doesn't really have any intention or meaning towards a certain reading. And that would mean that all the readings are more or less valid.
So here's why I'm excited about this. This is such a nerdy thing. When Andrew proposed this, I was just like, oh my God, we're going to be able to do a structuralism, formalism episode. This is going to be so nerdy, and we're going to disguise like super geeky grad school, homework shit as like, a fun discussion of pop culture. But stick with us, folks, because I think this is going to be really interesting. Your argument is sort of the argument of old world literary critics, the Matthew Arnolds of the world, for a name, just if you need one, if you want to impress people at weird literary parties that you don't go to, versus new criticism, and Frankfurt School post Walter Benjamin, new stuff. This is an argument that's happened in the world of literary criticism as, what is the nature of the critic? That is an argument with no official answer over like the last 150, 200 years, but that I think is an amazing thing to discuss. And I have my take on it. I expect everyone here, just because you're my friends, are going to have very similar takes to me, but I do think it's still worth discussing.
Yeah, I think it is really interesting because it's like, in a way, this question is sort of like, why do we humanities?
Yes.
Because when I was like thinking about this before the episode, it's like, this is the fundamental question of like, okay, if you've ever been in a freshman writing course in the humanities taught by somebody who teaches culture of any time period, basically, you will inevitably get the question of like, somebody will show up to your office hours and be like, well, how do I know if I'm right?
Yes.
And it's like, we need to talk about what right means when you're talking about culture and what evidence means when we talk about culture. And actually, I've been wanting to talk about evidence in general but I think that's another episode. But because, and I always tell my students, this is somewhat of a simplification, but I think it's a good starting point. There are no wrong readings. There are only better readings that are more grounded in evidence.
Ooh, wow, that's nicer. Because I'd be the asshole going, how do you know when you're right? which students hate. I would quibble. I would say that there are wrong readings, but some readings are more right than others. And, and there's varying levels.
A lot of that boils down to, do you present evidence for your reading?
Yes.
Yeah. That's the wrong reading is if you can't show me textual evidence and also to me, it's not just textual evidence and interpretation. You also need to ground it. I was trained by historicists. You have to ground your interpretation of the text in something outside of the text, whether that is, here are other literary movements that are related, or here's what was historically going on in that period. Because I think that's also kind of what separates the kind of analysis you do in undergrad to the kinds of things you do as a graduate student and then as a professor. Because when you're an undergrad, and this is the way we teach it, because when you're learning how to do this kind of analysis, we need to we focus do your interpretation, figure out an original argument, and we are usually focused on, can you make an argument? And there's evidence and things like that, but once you've mastered the basics of getting an argument, then you can get to the nuances of this is the kind of evidence that will adequately support this argument. This is how we evaluate evidence on a much more detailed level, which yes, you get some of that as an undergrad. We ask you to do research papers and things like that, but there's a level of rigor that I think most people okay, this is a bit of a tangent, and sorry for going off on this, but I think this is one of the things I have about when I see lay people reading peer-reviewed research. Not that I'm criticizing anyone for doing that at all. I think it's
God bless you if you want to try.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, sometimes I hate it, so bless you, and it's part of my job. Yes. But I think that's also part of the thing where it's if reading peer-reviewed research is very different if you are somebody who has been trained how to do this. And I don't mean that in a gatekeeping way. It's more of it's kind of gatekeeping by its nature, but it's basically there's a level of how to evaluate evidence and how to evaluate argument that most people don't participate in, because for most people this is not part of their daily lives. It is part of our daily lives.
Yeah, it's literally.
Anyway, that was my soapbox moment of the day.
Well, it's this weird thing that happens that becomes. I mean, it's an arrogant answer, but it's the true answer, because I end up in conversations because of the way I approach because of the way I approach scholarship, the way I approach criticism. I've said before on this show, and I've said this very much in my professional academic career, that I do not like the old style of criticism, the formalist school. I mentioned Matthew Arnold at the beginning. Matthew Arnold believed that the function of the critic was, the critic's job was to decide value. The critic would go, this is the true literature, this is not the true literature. It's how you end up with things like canon. It's how you end up with, no, what we have decided, this is what will be valuable. It's where you have academies from, Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences.
And it's the high culture versus low culture thing gets brought into that.
Yeah, it's really how high culture is determined.
Right.
Which I largely think is bullshit. If you haven't heard, if you've heard the show before,
if you haven't figured that out.
Yeah,
that's Matt's take on that argument.
Right. That said, where I think there is truth to that is what Katya is saying. If you I don't think you have to I don't think my opinions are necessarily better than anybody else's, but they're more studied. And I know it seems like I might think that they're better because of just the way I talk. It might sound egotistical. I've said this many times online when somebody's arguing with me about, somebody will say, well, you're wrong. And I'll say, I'm not wrong. And they're like, how do you know? And I'm like, because I do this for a living. It's literally all I do all day. And it's weird because it's not very obvious. I think people think that all I do is read comic books, and I don't. And in fact, that's very little of what I do, right? Mostly what I'm doing is reading cultural theory and psychology, and we vary the way we approach things varies as academics. So, for instance, Katya looks at a lot more history than I do. I look at a lot of psychology and a lot more philosophy and cultural theory. Hannah Hannah looks at lots of philosophy. Like that's her approach to doing
way more
to
about
doing
God
things.
than I will ever know about in my life.
She's forgotten way more than I want to know. Right. Like it's not that I enjoy that sort of thing. And there's different approaches. Wayne looks at things like I've read Wayne's papers. It's almost always a Jungian psychological viewpoint. That's just what you do. It's the way you see the world. Whereas I'm more likely to, how can I mix psychoanalysis with Marxism? That's just my approach to doing things. And it's fine, but like we know how to do that. So what ends up happening is we end up talking in this weird, we always say pseudo academic on this show because we end up talking in this weird academic shorthand that the five of us, plus our guests, tend to sort of back filter into popular culture talk in a way that is not the same as somebody who just says, I like Marvel movies because I like them, or this is bad, and if you this is good and this is bad, and if you don't think so, you're stupid. Like there's more nuance in our discussion, and that I think is the value of criticism. We also what?
We also often disagree, and I think what you're describing, the fact we have different approaches, that's what like this idea of like there are different levels of like that's what makes different readings possible.
Yes.
Like the way that like both Hannah and I talk about, different kinds of games. We both talk about games and game studies, and we have an episode coming up actually talking about different approaches to game studies and kind of like the history of that. But I can produce a reading based on historicism of a game. Hannah can produce a reading of the same game, or even the same segment of a game based on philosophy. We can come to like radically different conclusions, but if we're able to ground our arguments in evidence from both the text and from like secondary sources, our arguments are equally valid. And it's like that's what you're getting at is it's like in internet speak, we're not used, and I do this all the time on the internet too. It's like if I'm having an argument with somebody on Twitter, which I rarely do anymore, but like when I used to do that, it's a different kind of argument. I'm not making a high academic argument where I'm like making sure to ground myself in evidence, which actually, okay, I have a question about this. Because I think one of the challenges, this is a little bit off topic, but I think one of the challenges of like alternate readings and like what is a credible argument is when you're talking with people who don't speak the kind of like academic shorthand that Matt's talking about. Because I've been in arguments with people and they're like, well, cite your sources, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, I can't cite my sources because I am the source. Because there's a certain point where it's like,
when you have an expertise.
I have to reconstruct a bibliography of 7 years of reading for you.
Yeah, that's the thing with comics.
Yeah.
Well, I think, okay, backing up here for a second, just for, while we're talking about the idea of readings, maybe we need to define exactly what we mean by that.
Please
before we get too deep, because I mean we're already in kind of some academic weeds, which we tend to do, which is fine. But I think just giving a basic idea of what we mean by that, because I know in conversations with lots of people who don't do this is a weird idea. Like, people read something and then here's their interpretation of it, and that's what it is. And the idea that you and I can both read this thing and come away with two very different yet equally valid interpretations of what it is, that's a weird concept to people. So I think
I've got an example.
Go for it.
So this is like the earliest I can remember from when I was a teenager, like this example. And it's weird because so my brother John, guest of the show, is
our first guest.
One of the reasons that I thought of this, because he was like, well, you can look at it as Holocaust and Underground Railroad, and it can be both, right? You can read it both ways, and that's fine. And you just, which way do you want to talk about it? But my early memory is from John disagreeing with other siblings about a reading of something, which I assume he's just outgrown this, or maybe I'm remembering it more intensely. But it was.
He did comment on the blog, but he does not recall this conversation. So he did specifically say that.
But
did two different people have a different reading of a historical event?
I know John well. I know John well enough to believe that this conversation did happen. So go ahead.
And I don't remember exactly which sibling. So it could have been him and Joe, also a guest of the show. But it was at the end of the Harry Potter series. So spoilers for Harry Potter, but Harry has like a death and resurrection sequence. And there was a disagreement in the house about whether that was Christ motif or Phoenix motif. And I don't remember who was arguing for which side, but functionally, it really doesn't matter because it's definitely like simultaneous both and neither kind of thing. But it's like, and like, if you want to take one or the other, like,
context.
Cool. one is probably like, you can't say it's like, no, it's not Christ motif. It's definitely Phoenix motif. And if you read it as a Christ motif, you're wrong. It's like, it's a resurrection. It's a Christ motif. It's a resurrection. It's a Phoenix motif, right? Like it's both.
What those are. Yeah.
I mean, it's like, yeah, like one could argue kind of the same.
All stories are one could argue that all Christian resurrections are Phoenix motifs and vice versa.
Yeah.
One could make that argument. But you look at them in different ways, and I think that's what's fascinating. I think we should.
Yeah, it does give you a different vibe. If you're like, oh well, if I read it as Christ motif, then I look at some of the other elements of the story in this way. Or if I read it as Phoenix motif, I look at some of the things this way.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean the way you go into it, I mean the thing that grounds your reading changes your interpretation of all of it.
Right. And I think with academics in particular, or literary academics and film criticism, literary criticism, the stuff that we do on this show, mostly the stuff that Andrew does on both of his shows, I think that this becomes, this is the job, right? So we do it more often. But I do think this happens from non-academics as well on a micro level of,
absolutely.
If you've ever been to a comic book store and you see somebody arguing, no, Batman should be able to beat Superman, no, Superman should be able to beat Batman, you're doing that right there. There's no wrong or right answer. The right answer is who the fuck's writing the book, and he will decide. Like if I write the book Batman versus Superman, I'll pick a winner and that person will win. And there is no wrong or right answer because I'm writing Batman. But like usually when these arguments come down, because I've watched people have so much investment in this argument. Right. Oh, yeah. But like usually when you're doing this argument, you're like, well, if you think about Action Comics number 647, when, like people will sit there and they will cite their sources.
I would bum people out. They would come in with that question at the store. They would come in and just be like, so who would win in a fight? And my standard answer was, well, what does the story require?
Yeah.
And they would just kind of stare at me.
Yeah.
But like, wait, was your goal to argue? Or was your goal to like come to some sort of resolution?
Yeah, my goal was primarily to shut them up.
Right.
But I mean, their goal was to argue with somebody.
Yeah,
say, no, you're wrong.
So. Very much so. Yes,
and you're like,
very much so.
Here's a resolution to that dynamic.
Yeah, that's a really good example, though, because I think one of the things that also, because I've been thinking while we were talking about this, I've been thinking about if there's a difference between interpretation and a reading. But I think also what Wayne's getting at goes back to the question of like the better and worse readings, because that person, like, okay, I feel like I keep going back to like writing 101 things, but fair reference. But like one of the things I always got from my teachers, and I absolutely always like talk to my students about, is like the so what, who cares thing. Because, and I think like Wayne's example of like a comic book guy and like what the story requires is absolutely right, because it's like there is a certain point where like there are practical realities of crafting a narrative in whatever media, like in order to tell certain kinds of stories. So you can make all of these kinds of arguments about like, is X superhero more powerful than Y superhero? But it's like, why does that matter? If it's just a functional aspect of telling the story, it's like, well, then there's no conversation to be had. It
only matters if you're playing HeroClix,
which is not like I'm 100% positive / know for a fact that there are people who find that argument very compelling. I'm not one of them. And that's fine. But like, there's nothing wrong with finding that argument compelling. But like, I think that I think I could probably speak with some accuracy for this particular group. Like, we are more interested in much more like philosophically abstract, bizarre questions than other people. But I think, I think with Mav's point about like people do this on a micro scale a lot is like, this is, and we've said this on the show many times before, this is part of the lineage of cultural studies as a field.
It's where the we resolve nothing at the end always comes from. And we always say that at the end of the joke. That's why we know we can't. We never will.
Like, I have to joke that some of the best writing about video games comes from game wikis and Reddit. And I'm entirely facetious about this, because to be like, as a field, game studies is a little squishy baby. It's been going on for decades, but in the history of like academic fields, it is a little squishy baby.
So it's comics.
And like, we depend a lot on the work of fan communities, especially when you're talking about like preservation of older materials and archives. Like, I mean, this is also true of sci-fi pulps. The study of early science fiction would not exist without a bunch of very dedicated nerds thinking about stuff.
Yep.
Like, which is also why, like, some of the stuff I said earlier about gatekeeping, I mean, this is why also, like, that gatekeeping isn't really gatekeeping, because, like, you can absolutely produce amazing argument, amazing scholarship, and there are people that do this without ever having formal training as an academic. And actually, I would argue that people who do it well, a lot of times their arguments more interesting.
Well, so for superhero comics in particular, comics in general, but for American comics in general, I should qualify that. France was always very good about like realizing the cultural relevance of comics, and to a lesser extent, Japan always has been. America, not so much. And particularly with superhero stuff and, you know, what we now consider geek stuff, there's a gap of literary criticism in American superhero studies that goes from about 1957 to about 1979, 80, where literally there are no articles written academically. There's nothing. I know. I had to do like comps, which are, you know, like it's a part of getting a PhD is doing this part where you have to do these exams, which are you have to read everything that was written in the field. And I got to this 20-year period where no one published anything. It was just like literally there were zero. There's like one essay by Umberto Eco and then nothing for like a couple of decades. But like if you turn over to what's being written in zines, what's being written in the popular, it wasn't really popular, but the comic book community, the Comic-Con community, there's all kinds of stuff. Like
and self-published stuff. Yeah, there's tons of stuff.
What's the thing for a dime?
All in color for a dime.
All in color for a dime. Like things like that are being written in this period where the Academy, you know, and the official things is ignoring it. So you end up with very, very interesting readings of literary texts, but from people who are not formally trained, and I think are just as interesting. So like when I say something, I know because this is my job. I try to be careful when I say that. Like when I say it, sometimes I'm being cocky, but also when I say it, it's usually because I really mean it, as opposed to I try not to pull that card when it's just someone's reading. If someone's quoting a logical fact wrong, like if someone's saying something that is fundamentally wrong about someone else's theory, I'll correct it. You know, or you know, how does some psychoanalysis thing work? I can correct that. But if you're just talking about whether you like something or what something means to you, then you have as long as you have evidence for it to where it means something valid to you, that's fine. And I think it's actually the most interesting part of what we do is looking at multiple readings. I don't care if people disagree with me. I like seeing, well, how did you get there? Because this is fascinating. For instance, as we record this, we are a week out past the conclusion of the television series Loki, which I'm sure a lot of our fans liked or watched, because this is I know our audience, right? And I watched it and I enjoyed it. And as I said in the blog, but also on Facebook, I hated the final episode of the season. I really, really hated it. I think I said it was my least favorite episode of anything MCU other than the Inhumans TV show. Like I hated everything about that final episode. But what I really did enjoy in particular is I loved the analyses of two friends of the show, Brian at Church of the Geek and TK at There Was an Idea. They both did retrospectives on it, and I loved listening to their takes on it and them explain why they loved it. I disagree with them. They're friends of mine. I disagree, but I enjoyed listening to those two podcasts talk about their reasons for liking Loki and their analysis of why they liked it more than I enjoyed the show. So I think there's a lot of geeky fun. I mean, like if you admit it, if you're having the Batman versus Superman argument, having the Batman versus Superman argument is fun, and it's not as fun if somebody says Superman because he can fly. That's boring, right? It becomes interesting when somebody has a good take, right?
And yeah, to go back to my example earlier, it's not like I have never participated in those conversations, you know?
Yeah.
But I, we do it much like we do here. I give reasons. People ask me, Marcel, my roommate, who has been on the show a lot, he will present me with things, just knowing my background in these characters. He will present me with odd matchups just to see me logic my way through of why I choose what I do. And it's not just a matter, because he's stronger. I do it from that narrative point of view. I mean, aside from the what does the story require, but once again, there's that level of analysis and reading that goes into it.
Mm-hmm. And here's an example. This is one that I think is fascinating. This is a reading. I'm gonna reference Andrew's show. You will know how long ago you did it. At some point, you guys did an episode on the protagonist on the Mr. Miracle, Tom King's Mr. Miracle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's several months back at least.
Yeah, and probably even more than that.
I remember us talking about this.
Yeah, and I talked to Wayne about this because I thought I love that episode of your show. You guys went through, and I don't remember who your guest was, but it was you, Joe, and whoever your guest was went through, and you did a reading of the I'm a big Tom King fan.
I'm thinking this was probably Todd Peterson was probably our guest. He's a frequent guest. And I think he's been our guest for Tom King discussions.
Yeah, I believe it. Okay, I believe it was. So you, Todd, and Joe are discussing Mr. Miracle, a book that I love, Tom King, an author that I love. Wayne, I know you're a big fan. Katya, I don't know if you have read him, but what's amazing is you guys talked at length for a good hour where you analyze this wonderful, beautiful superhero book, and you talk about how it's not really about superheroics. It is the story of a new father dealing with, the trauma of essentially new fatherhood. That's how you guys read it, which makes sense because I believe when you watched it, you were the newest. I mean, Joe has kids, Todd has kids. Mm-hmm. You had very young children at the time.
Yeah, new kids.
Yeah, you had brand new kids.
I think I talked about that when reading an issue about childbirth, holding like a 3-month-old.
Right.
Like as I was helping her fall asleep. I think that's I'm trying to remember the details from the episode, but I remember now that you're talking about like that sequence, I'm like, well, that's putting me like into context. Like, yeah, there's like a childbirth issue in that story. I'm like, I'm holding I've just been in the hospital in recent memory.
Watching this happen, and you talked about Scott. Scott is the main character's name of Mr. Miracle. You talked about Scott's experience watching his wife give birth and being able to relate to it. And I'm listening to this going, that's magical. I love listening to Andrew because again, you were the newest of the three fathers talking about it. Like listening to you relate to this moment was amazing, wonderful radio. And then I told Wayne this, they're wrong and they needed a non-father on the show, but it was amazing. It was so beautiful because I love being able to see your experience from it, but that's not at all what I get from that graphic novel. That graphic novel is about personal trauma and struggle and suicidal thoughts and like darkness. Like I have my own reading of it that comes from my life experience, which is completely separate from yours because I don't have kids. I can't feel that, and that's what made it amazing. Just like hearing you explain it was like, oh my God, that's so beautiful, Andrew.
Well, part of the reason also like both experiences are valid is it's like, I think like people, I think especially from the outside, but I think even within academia, we get really hung up on the idea of like, what is the ultimate meaning of a text, right? Even though that's not actually what our field does, because like books and movies and television and games and whatever, like these are tools for thinking with. And like they're tools, basically. They're not, we produce meaning in conversation with these things. Like there are ways for us to understand the world around it. Think of it almost like, a very abstract version of like a telescope, right? We're using these things to investigate our own feelings, experiences, blah, blah, blah. This is why we go back and reinterpret text. Like our readings now of Moby Dick are very different than they would have been in like the 1920s. And it's not just because like it's not because we have a deeper historical understanding of Moby Dick, which is like true. There's like some archival stuff that pops up, and like sometimes we know more about like the context in which a text was written or about the author than we did previously. But really the reason why we reinterpret things, and also things leave the canon, because that does sometimes happen. I've had long conversations with professors who lament the fact that they think Henry James is leaving the canon, and I have thoughts about that. But
personal thought. Bye.
No, I think that's right. Actually, because Henry James is no longer my argument, and these scholars who bemoan this, at least in our conversations, agree. Like Henry James is no longer a useful tool for thinking about contemporary experience. It's part of the reason why
I'm with you.
And it doesn't mean he wasn't important in his own time. It doesn't mean he wasn't important for the historical evolution of like literary realism in the United States.
Or that you can't enjoy reading some Henry James if you want to.
Absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead.
Absolutely. Like,
you're on Amazon. You can buy them right now.
And all this stuff, but like Henry James' usefulness for a tool for as a tool for thinking with is diminished compared to what it was at a different point in history. That's not a value judgment.
Different point in history 15 years ago. Not even far back.
Not even that long ago.
Yeah.
But I think like that's the thing. It's like about like the like good readings and like readings coexisting. It's like if it is a useful tool for you to think with, I think that's a valid reading in my mind.
And like this goes into like the way Mav described his experience with Mr. Miracle. It's like when Mav says like, oh, that's really interesting. You're wrong. What Mav means is like, you're wrong for me. That like, I can't read it that way because it just doesn't work for me.
And so funny.
And the thing,
you're not wrong.
And I had much the same experience as Mav did when he talked about this, you know, and you know, listening to your podcast and hearing you guys. I didn't have that experience with it either. I don't have kids. I've never had that experience. And while I certainly read those parts of the book, they did not speak to me in the same way.
Right.
And
you guys talked for an hour, and the fact that he's suicidal for most of the book was almost an afterthought.
Was not a big part of our discussion.
Yeah. and the book, I mean, well, actually, spoilers and trigger warning if anybody's going to try to read this book, which you should, because it's it's an amazing book.
It's really good.
And I think I'll say that I'll read it. We'll say that. It's a book where the main character tries to kill himself on the first page. That's how the book starts. So you know that could be traumatic. It could be traumatic, and you guys barely talked about it, which for me was amazing. I love that episode of your show because what's great about it is I know the reading of Mr. Miracle as a study in trauma and personal trauma because that's how I read it. I loved hearing the three of you relate to this in a way that is completely foreign to me. That's what made it interesting. Wayne, you always said, you know, how much you loved Luke Cage as a kid because you didn't know any real life black people at that point. So
it was an incredibly important book to me in 1972. It as cliche and horrible and blaxploitation as I know it is now, that was my first. Well, that and Good Times, you know,
right?
TV, you know, the Jeffersons. Those were my first glimpses into a non-white and very specifically urban black setting with all of those. Not to use urban in the cliche form, meaning black.
Urban is the actual city. We haven't said it in a while, but Wayne grew up literally in the middle of nowhere, in a one-horse town is where Wayne's from. But
and we had to share the horse, so you know.
I think that's the power of. I mean, toot horns of our shows. I mean, I specifically mentioned several friends of this show because I think that's what's interesting. Like Protagonist, your show, Andrew, you guys are doing you guys are a show that looks at essentially you approach a different book every week from the perspective of doing that senior year seminar paper, and it's what you do every week, which I think is amazing, right? And then you know our show is a bunch of guys hanging around at a bar drinking and talking about, you know, a bunch of academics hanging at a bar drinking and talking about whatever the topic is. Church of the Geek, again, friends of ours, but a show I enjoy. Church of the Geek is very much them going, it's two ministers saying, okay, how can we look at this from a theological bend? I love their show. I've been on their show a couple of times. They know listen to this show. I'm a godless heathen. I'm a horrible person, right? But they like me, and I
like us anyway. Yeah.
Wayne, you've been on the show. It's great hearing smart people talk about that. There was an idea,
and listening to shows like that.
Teacher. Yeah,
I was going to say, and listening to shows like that is very definitely a perspective from which I do not read this stuff.
Right. And it's important for us to learn that way. It's
absolutely.
So moving in, again, I said I wanted to do a lot of schoolish stuff on this episode. I disparage Matthew Arnold. I don't like him as a critic. I'm as somebody who's a professional literary critic now. I'm allowed to make that choice. Katya said expertise. I can just disparage one literary critic who's been dead for 140 years. Okay.
Well, that's your reading of it.
Agree with Matthew Arnold. The world has largely moved on to at least most a more nuanced understanding.
Right. And,
anyway.
But to look at the Walter Benjamin version where he says the storyteller, he's like, the storyteller's dead. And a lot of the meaning's not just produced by the person telling the story anymore. Meaning's produced by the reader, right? Mm-hmm. Like reading is a contract with the author. And this is the way we almost always approach things on this show. It's absolutely the way Andrew and Joe approach things on your show, right? Like what does this text mean? Well, you're reading it. You tell me what it means, right?
Yeah.
Like that's
that was another question that I wanted to ask, and I think Katya's mentioned it like a couple times, like getting into the idea of this. But I wrote down 4 different words, and I think it's like, okay, like 2 of them are each on one side of the thing, and I wrote down like meaning and tension, and I wrote down interpretation and reading. Yeah, and as much as they're on the opposites, I'm actually starting to think that meaning and reading are almost on the same side, where it's like it's not about like what was the intention of the author. It's about what it means to me. And if I read something as a father, that creates a meaning for me. Or if you read something not as a father and as, someone with experience with trauma or something, then that's going to be a different thing. And that's your.
I've had lots of problems. Yeah, I've had lots of problems dealing with mental health. So like, that's what I saw. I'm like, oh my God, this is the book for me.
And this is part of why in lots of branches of literary study at this point, like the Benjaminian approach that Mav just described, where it's like we like that the reader or whatever media, consumer of whatever media is co-creating the story, is co-creating the co-creating even the meaning is like the central, this like become. I mean, I would argue at this point, like the dominant trend in the humanities in general. Yeah. I'm sure that people would argue with that, but like formalism people still practice formalism, but I think it's much less common, and people often do it in conjunction with this more modern notation, because I think we've all recognized that in a world that is increasingly dominated by media, it's frankly it's a more useful conversation to have, because it's like talking about why one individual or a group of individuals creates a text, like there is value in that, but talking about how people receive those stories, use those stories either in their individual lives or to construct community and all this stuff in many ways, not only, I mean, in my subjective opinion, is more interesting, but also I think is infinitely more consequential, because it's like we construct society through storytelling, and knowledge. Like there is no knowledge without storytelling. I've had this argument with so many quantitative people and I've convinced many of them. Like every fact you know about the world is a story you have told yourself. I don't care if it's math. Math is a story describing the world. Like we are like one of the things that distinguishes us as a species is we tell stories to transfer knowledge. This is how we do all the things.
And if we give all the power to the creators of the narrative, you can't distinguish that from propaganda then. Yeah.
It's basically saying people are passive in the construction of culture. Really not true.
Right. Absolutely. Well, and also, I mean, aside from you and I having a different reading of something, I can come to the same book at different points in my life and have a very different reading of it, because if I have a kid,
person. I'm going to change my mind on the story than Andrew.
Right. And just I can think of significant books in my life. Something I read in my mid-20s that was hugely influential on my thinking and my way of seeing the world that just really clicked for me, and then I would reread it 20 years later, and it was a very different book because I was a very different person. One in particular, it still held a tremendous amount of meaning for me, but it was completely different meaning. And then I've read other stuff that I read in my 20s, like, oh, this was amazing. I go back to it now and go, what the fuck?
I hate this now.
What was I thinking?
And like you guys have said so much about like kind of divorcing your meaning and your reading from intentions of the author and everything. But I like sometimes there really are intentions of the author and being aware of those. And sometimes it's really obvious. Like I'm going to say like Zack Snyder's Superman is an extremely clear Christ allegory, right? Like Zack Snyder portrays Superman as Christ. And I'm like, now, originally Superman, I would think of more of as a Moses allegory because he was created by Jewish guys and it's big in the basket and all that sort of stuff. But when Zack Snyder makes Superman, that is Christ. And
Zack Snyder, he said it. And there have certainly been, and there's certainly Superman as a Christ metaphor has been there for a long time as well. I agree with you.
He didn't invent it, but he definitely intends it.
He definitely intends it. Well, and I've had that conversation with different friends of mine, people who I'm going to move the conversation over to music for a second, I get into performers and songwriters, and I read a lot of music biographies, and it changed the way I interact with the music. I'm going to use my favorite example of David Bowie for that. I have a friend who's a huge fan, has read nothing about Bowie's life. He just listens to music. He likes the songs. He likes the lyrics, as do I. But I find when I read what was going on in this person's life at this time, what was the things he was reading, the things he was experiencing, there are other meanings to the lyrics that come out of that, things he certainly intended at the time. So, but both are valid. I still can enjoy it just as a song.
It's a different way of constructing meaning with additional information. So
right. It's not like that I would never tell him that he can't construct meaning or enjoy this without knowing these things. And his experience of that is
I think this gets into a question. I might be backtracking on some of the things I said earlier, although, I'm not sure yet. I haven't decided. Welcome to being an academic. Well, because I was talking, I think, I started the episode talking about the difference between a reading based in expertise versus, and I think what we're talking about, and what I've been thinking about is what is the difference between a reading based in expertise of literary critic, blah, 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 Mav knows all the theory, I do historicism, blah, 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 versus reading based in personal experience. And I don't think it's a binary. I am very, there are academics who feel that they can be objective about a text. I personally feel that is impossible. There is no way for me to guarantee that my academic approach to a text is not influenced by my personal experience of that. I have written, I wrote my, one of my, my undergraduate honors thesis. That's the nerdiest thing I've said in a long time, about Ender's Game. It was grounded in evidence, argument, theory, all of that stuff. Nothing in there is written about my personal experience because I was being an academic. And I think that's part of the difference between an academic interpretation versus a personal interpretation. But it is very much grounded in the fact that Ender's Game was a very influential book for me when I was 10 years old. And then when I was revisiting as an adult, realized my favorite novel as a kid was written by a person I do not agree with. And then B is a book about child soldiers. And I was like, wait a second, I was 10 years old. This entire novel is about child soldiers. And how did I not pick up on that? And it was because I was basically ooh, lasers are cool, man.
I think I've got an example. I have some notes of different examples, and I think I've got an example for you of where I think the interpretation, the reading that someone's going to have is really about what and academically, this is kind of backed up either way, but depending on what your personal anxiety is, you could read Invasion of the Body Snatchers a certain way, because I love Invasion of the Body Snatchers because I watched it in a film class in college, and our teacher, our professor, couched it in terms of being the opposite of The Day the Earth Stood Still. And he said, Day the Earth Stood Still, kind of pro-communist, right? Invite the outsider and they can help make world better. And then we watched Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and he intended, he couched it as this is anti-McCarthyist, or is it? And we talked about it. We were oh, is it anti-communist or anti-McCarthyist? It doesn't really matter because it's anti-homogeneity, right? It's and both of, and that's the fear, right? So if you are in the 60s and you're looking at this and you're anxious about the homogeneity of communism, then maybe you say, as an academic, well, here's all my evidence showing how the pod people are the communists and how they're going to infiltrate, and you got to watch out for your neighbors and all that sort of stuff. And then you watch it in the 2000s, where there's a lot of heavy criticism against McCarthyism and the enforced homogeneity in an attempt to fight homogeneity. And you say, oh, this is a stunning rebuke of McCarthyism and how they're going to turn everything into a just gross, super consistent, no free will kind of community. And it's all right, but the creators didn't have any intention either way, right? It's fairly well documented. They've done a ton of interviews. There's a ton of writing on it. I know because Jill and I have recorded an episode on it that hasn't been released yet, but they really they don't mean it either way, but you can totally read both of them 100% simultaneously. As someone's fear and anxiety.
An example Mav and I have talked about, I think we've talked about this on the show, in the Civil War era of Marvel, where everybody saw Captain America as what they believed in. I had a friend who came into the store who was incredibly conservative, and Cap was the conservative fighting against big government. Captain America,
big government,
right? Where I see this and it's Tony Stark is just the epitome of industrial military complex, and putting these people in prison is obviously Guantanamo Bay, and he didn't see that at all.
Right.
And having that conversation at that time in the store with different people, it just struck me as hysterical how everybody, no matter what your politics were, identified with Captain America.
This was before the show came out, before we started doing the show, obviously. So, but I remember Wayne, I remember us going there. We would survey people.
Yeah.
No one was on Team Iron Man. And so it was different when the MCU did their version because because Tony Stark was Robert Downey Jr. and there was nobody was on Team Iron Man in the comics. Everyone was Team Cap, and everyone had a very different idea of what Team Cap meant.
Yep.
I know many people who are Iron Man pre-movies.
Right. Oh, no. I mean, but in the Civil War argument on that specific series, because everybody thought there were people who liked Iron Man. We meant in this series, they really thought, everyone thought that this series was an allegory for, they knew Cap was the good guy and Iron Man was the bad guy in it, and it was always an allegory for whatever you happen to believe. People believe that, which is, that goes to
what allegories do.
Our wrong versus right thing. My example that I used in the blog was Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz, and I don't think he's doing a bit. I don't think he's trying to be cute for, like, Ted Cruz is often saying stuff provocatively to be an asshole to, as a politician, and he's trying to like pick up the Trump voter. And I'm just going to say it, I'm obviously, again, you listen to the show, I'm not a big Trump fan. Go figure. But Trump is cooler than Ted Cruz, which is to say, not like I want to hang out with him, but Trump's a better troll than Ted Cruz is. He knows how. Trump's very good at being an internet troll. And Ted, I don't think Ted's internet trolling on this one, though. Ted really fundamentally believes, he went out and saw the Avengers movie. He saw Infinity War, and he believes he's watching a movie about the evil Democrats trying to destroy the universe. And he explained it in an interview. And watching Ted Cruz explain how Thanos represents Democrats is fascinating, because he's not making it up. He really fundamentally believes this. He's a crazy person. He's wrong. I'm okay saying he's wrong on this one, because I've heard Anthony Russo talk for more than 2 seconds, and it's very obvious that's not what he intends at all. But I guess the author is dead, so Ted can have that reading, I guess.
I think especially I would be interested to hear other people's take on this, but as somebody who looks at history, crowd opinions matter to me.
Yes, I agree too.
What the dominant, not to say that the dominant reading is always correct, but the dominant reading of a particular story. Let's stay on Marvel universe and Thanos, I guess, and I don't know, all these things.
Historically speaking, the dominant reading becomes the only reading.
Often, yeah.
Oh, yeah. It becomes the dominant reading becomes the one that we believe we know from history, which is to say, we remember Moby Dick in its time as, this is one of my favorite historical novels, in case you hadn't figured that out on this episode.
I'm also a big fan of Moby Dick.
It's great. Oh my God.
It's a super good read, guys.
It's wonderful. And it's mainly, this is nothing to do with what I like, the substance of my comment, but I mainly love Moby Dick because there are two kinds of people who enjoy Moby Dick. There are people who enjoy Moby Dick because it's a great adventure story, and they really hate the cetiology chapters. For people who don't know what I'm talking about, cetiology chapters are all of the weird chapters that are about whale facts. And then there are my people, who I believe are the correct people, who think the cetiology chapters are the best part because they're just sort of adventure novel, adventure model. Suddenly, I'm going to pontificate on the experience of being a giant squid for 10 pages.
Yeah. It's also it's canonically Phone Bone's favorite book as well. From the Bone series. So
let me describe this wave for 20 solid pages. What are you doing?
Yes. Favorite thing, and I read about this in somebody else's article, which I do not remember anymore, so take this with a grain of salt. But supposedly Moby Dick also set back the study of whales by many decades because he makes kind of fake footnotes to make it look like, and it's a novel. He has whale facts in there, many of which are true, many of which are not. And many of the ones that are not, he presents them as if they are based in some kind of evidence. They are, many of them not. They're not just wrong because of the understanding of the science at the time. There's some of those. There are also ones that are wrong because he made them up for literary effect. But a lot of people, because it was presented as a sort of the sailor's knowledge of whales, believed these things to be true because also Melville was a sailor. And so, yeah, that's one of my favorite things. Also, Edgar Allan Poe lied about all of his publication figures, and that was only discovered 10 years ago. Random facts you learn that are not really helpful but are endlessly fascinating.
I want to keep on. I mean, Moby Dick's a good example because of all of literature of people in our world, in our academic world, right? Moby Dick's one of the books that has the most monographs out there. And what a monograph is, for people who don't know the term, there's a part of academic criticism where people will write a book where the entire purpose of the book is just my interpretation of this one other book, right? And there's Moby Dick was written once, but there must be hundreds of people who have written books that are just my interpretation of Moby Dick. People
all of which are
adding their footnotes and everything.
Yes. Yeah.
Well,
citing the Bible
and this is how we how interpretations have a tendency to yes, to Wayne's point about the dominant reading becomes the only reading, but our readings rewrite history. Yeah. So, for example, Moby Dick was not an exceptionally popular novel when it was published. Everyone at the time, critics were said whatever, not his best work. It is not the thing that in his period Melville was known for.
And it's also 2,000 pages long, and he's talking about a wave for it's weird,
a strange novel.
It's weird.
We need a great American writer.
And so the thing is, it's in his time, it was not a particularly important novel. It's not the thing that at the time people thought Melville was going to be if they thought Melville was going to be remembered. It is not the thing that they thought he was remembered for. It is probably the only Melville text that most people can name who aren't literary scholars. And even many who are literary scholars. And
I'm hard pressed to remember the other ones.
The amount of pop culture references in science fiction to Moby Dick is amazing. At some point, we need to do an episode on my entire theory about how Moby Dick is the beginning of American science fiction, because I totally believe it is. Star Trek has made references to it.
Star Trek Wrath of Khan is all about Moby Dick. Khan didn't get it. He doesn't understand the book that he seems to be quoting, but
no, well, that's a whole different problem. But it's in there. It's in, but
Jaws is Moby Dick.
There's a war comic from early 70s of DC war comic of the character of Captain Storm, who's in The Losers. His origin story where he loses a leg and is hunting down a Nazi submarine that caused him to lose his leg, that I totally plagiarized for a writing assignment in 5th grade, not knowing that it was a takeoff on Moby Dick when I plagiarized it. and I have no memory of what grade I got or what the teacher said, if they thought I was a genius because I was able to metaphorically write a Moby Dick story as a war story, not knowing I stole it from a comic.
Great writing happens. It's just accident. But I think
do your homework, kids.
Yeah. Don't plagiarize comic books.
I mean, you did it accidentally. Same like plagiarism. Anyway. But I think and this is, I think the fascinating thing about this conversation we're having is the power of readings to rewrite history is kind of is endlessly fascinating, because literally most people. This is not a question that most people will ever be posed in their life, unless you are people like us of name, X amount of great American novels. But on most of those lists, Moby Dick shows up because a bunch of people who lived after Melville died that
wanted a great American novel
decided. This is also true. And there are so many, the American canon is filled with more of these novels, the ones that have been rewritten as to be important, than ones that were historically important in their own time. I am sure this is also true of other national traditions as well, because we decide, like we were talking about earlier, it's we are constantly reevaluating what are the important texts for the period in which we live in. We always reread these things through the lens of our present moment, even when we are doing historical reinterpretation.
Well, there's the phrase, the Great American Songbook, which, oddly enough, ignores a tremendous amount of blues and jazz and folk music and, so...
Stuff written by black people, yes.
yeah.
And I really did like you said, where you said historic, we'll rewrite the history of things, and that gets into the X-Men because it's rewritten as being a civil rights story, and people treat it like it started in the 60s as a civil rights story. And it's like, not really, guys. Like that really doesn't count until the 70s at least.
It was a third-tier superhero book.
And
arguably the 80s.
And then you've got people who are like, and this is something I heard on a podcast, which I stopped listening to because I was like, I don't know if I'm here for like this level of analysis, where they're like, no, being a Holocaust survivor is so critical to Magneto's identity. I'm like, that did not even matter until like way deep into his existence. I was like, his argument was like, you can't recast Magneto as a black person. He has to be a Holocaust survivor. That means he has to be Jewish. I'm like, I'm pretty sure you could get away as reinterpreting Magneto as a lot of different things. Anyone who experienced depression, you're probably good to go. Yeah,
he wasn't Jewish for the first half of his existence.
I mean, it's a throwaway line, and God loves me. That's the 80s. He's been around 20 something years, and then it doesn't matter until the X-Men films. But I do want to. I mean, before we run out, I do want to point out, Andrew, your brother Joe, your co-host, he reminded us that, speaking of monographs, in his book, he relates a story about Scott Lobdell, who wrote the X-Men for many, many years, tells a story about how, I'm just gonna read from Joe's book, which
I think this section is going to be direct quoting from Scott Lobdell.
Yes, Lobdell, a writer of the X-Men comic and creator of several mutant characters, shared the following experience. One of the most astounding things that ever happened in my life was at a store signing in Florida at the height of X-Mania, or my wild ride at the time. I was given an adorable 18-year-old handler to get me from the motel to the diner, to the store and such. We were talking at one point, and she was saying how much her brother and his friends loved the X-Men and how my writing spoke to them as outsiders who stick together because of their outsider status. As the writer who outed Northstar, the first gay superhero in mainstream comics years before, I assumed her brother and his friends were gay. I was surprised when she explained, no, they were skinheads, specifically white supremacists. What? My first inclination was to explain that her brother and his friends had completely not gotten the ideals of inclusion and tolerance the X-Men stood for. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't really have my cake and eat it too. I couldn't say the X-Men is about finding strength and being the other and then get upset because the other didn't fit my definition of what I felt was acceptable otherness. Don't get me wrong. When you look at the flip side of the Xavier inclusionary viewpoint, you get Magneto's almost Nazi-esque master race thesis to the degree that this girl's brother was not running around and gay bashing or involved in hate crimes. The notion that a subsection of society felt that they needed to come together because what made them was threatened, or that they were looking to find strength in each other. That strikes me as valid as others gravitating to the X-Men. And it's such a weird thing hearing Lobdell, who as a writer reflecting on his own work, saying that, because it's almost sort of like I can see how he might almost get canceled for even saying it, right? Right?
That's some dicey territory saying,
it's
okay, read it how you want.
But I get his point, and I think he was trying to be very careful, saying no, I deplore these people, but I have to understand them, and that's kind of where I was getting. I think Cruz is less vile. I found somebody more vile than Ted Cruz, literal skinheads. I don't like Ted Cruz, but
you don't say.
Yeah, I guess I mean, I think that matters, and I think that to the extent that literature matters, we need to sort of recognize the power in multiple interpretations. I can point to the There Was an Idea podcast, right? And where her TK's interpretation of Loki, and because I like her and I like what she stands for, even though I didn't enjoy the episode, I can enjoy her reading of it. I can enjoy Andrew. I can enjoy because I'm not inherently opposed to the idea of fatherhood, right? It's like, oh, fatherhood's evil, so therefore. So when you have something that's like an awful reading of something, it becomes harder. But I do think that there is usefulness in sort of understanding how the people got there.
Mm-hmm. People got there, but I think also and this is separate from whether it's based on evidence. One of my criteria for what makes a good or a bad interpretation is if it's an interpretation that does harm. Because I had this argument not too long ago about someone that was basically doing a reading of a text that we always joke on the show that eugenics is bad. They were doing a reading of a text that basically said this was an argument in favor of eugenics, and they were specifically specifically doing it in a way that like wasn't saying this text is an argument in favor of eugenics and eugenics bad. Mm-hmm. They were just basically going to like, oh, and this shows that there are aspects of eugenics that are redeemable. And it's like, no,
right.
That's bad reading because you are using a text, however well grounded in evidence, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. Your reading is you're using a reading to hurt people.
I have a question then. Is it a bad reading or is it a good reading and just what you want to do deplorable? Like you can be a horrible person. You can use, if we're saying you can interpret things, if we're saying the meaning is created by both the author and the reader, then sure, you have, it's not that reading is bad, it's that you are bad. You are a bad person who believes in eugenics. That's
like you're taking advantage of it for a bad purpose.
Yes.
I think if it's a personal reading, I think that's the right take. I think with the, and this was in my experience is in an academic context. I think when you're in an academic context, you're doing it as a professional, those are the same thing.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Because we talked a few times about like what it means to be an expert and which also goes along with that, what it means to be an authority. And it's like, you are making an authoritative claim. Mm-hmm. You are using that authority to promote a harmful narrative.
Mm-hmm. You're using your powers for evil. With great power comes great responsibility.
I think that means that both, and I think in that context, it's both you are being a harmful person in that moment, and also your reading is bad because it is causing harm. And that is a subjective standard that has nothing to do with whether or not the argument is based on evidence. Although I would argue that any argument that leads to eugenics is probably based on shitty evidence anyway, because hello.
Yeah.
I think this might be the thing to like wrap up on. I got one last example. And this is one that people might be familiar of, or you could find a clip of it online, I'm sure. Parks and Rec had a sequence that involved this, where there was a debate about whether Twilight was problematic because it was overtly Christian or problematic because it wasn't Christian. And they don't go into it much. They just have like two extremists on opposite sides where they're arguing about it. They're like, no, this book is unacceptable because it has all these things that are not acceptable by conservative Christianity. There's quivering, there's vampires, there's intense stares. This is not okay from a conservative Christian standpoint. And then someone else is saying, like, no, the problem is that it has overtly Christian themes in this story about morality. And
I find this amazing because neither of those are my problem with Twilight. But yes, I see the argument. And I'm not,
so many arguments.
And they're just using it it's just for a comedic gag about like, this is how people argue about stuff when they feel intensely about them. And they're going to say, because it's something that they hate. No, you're wrong about why I hate this.
Yeah,
I don't think that's a constructive way to use multiple readings. I just wanted to throw that out there. I think what we've talked about for most of the episode is the constructive way to use multiple readings.
Yeah, I would find that fascinating.
Me too. And like,
so that constructive in that conversation. I mean, I keep going back to like where the line is between like an academic, like what's valid academically and what's valid at a personal level. As if I was a historian looking back on the impact of Twilight, that dichotomy, even in a facetious like context, would be fascinating and massively instructive.
Yeah, and I want to. I mean, both Hannah and Monica know that text. We talked about it a couple episodes ago. They both know this text way better than any of us do. One of them likes it and one does not. Go listen to our back catalog and find out which is which. But that said, I think Twilight is problematic because the climactic scene is when one of the guys decides he wants to fuck a baby. That's how it ends. That's the point of Twilight. and it really is. And that's my reading of it. But it's also just the plot of Twilight. It's so weird to me that they looked at just the extremes, but maybe that's where a lot of this comes from, right? Like if we think about what readings are, here's where I want to end. Readings often are the most common reading on the internet. I think hot take. Here's my hot take, and whenever a new movie comes out, I've got to be the first to publish on YouTube my hot take on Black Widow, on G.I. Joe Snake Eyes, which came out this week, and is ruining the box office game. But when people like hot takes they're readings, and I don't know that they're all good, but that's what they really are. It's somebody saying, here's my take on this film, on this book. And to look at just the extremes, I think that's what we do. It's what like internet criticism sort of devolved into. Either you are with us or against it. You know, this is either the greatest movie or the worst movie of all time because of these reasons. And if you don't agree with me, you're an idiot. Like, I think that's what a lot of internet criticism is, as opposed to the part that like I said, is fun for me. I like hearing other people's views of stuff, even when I don't agree with it, because that's how knowledge is created.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah. Those extremes can get both intolerant and intolerable. And when you're somewhere in the middle, that's like the good academic juicy stuff where you can have extremes and opposites, but you can tolerate them.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. They are like takes that can be tolerated.
They can always, sure.
And we just run into this all the time. I think part of the problem is people have their reading of it and simply can't comprehend that there is any other reading of it.
Right.
There's that inability to ever see someone else's point of view, and that's problematic no matter what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of those hot takes you're talking about and the internet yelling at each other is exactly that. That people are yelling at each other because their point of view is not being validated. How dare you see something differently than I do?
You like the Snyder Cut? How dare you? You hate the Snyder Cut? How dare you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Valid my opinion, but also I have no reason for why my reading is valid, and refuse to give one.
Yeah.
Or even if they do, I mean, I think some people do give reasons, and even well considered ones. And then, but like the idea that like if you don't agree with my reading, something is fundamentally wrong with you. That's a problem for me.
That's where you get back to bring it all the way back to the beginning. That's where you get the intolerant blackface take on 101 Dalmatians. Like these dogs are getting covered in soot. That's blackface. I know blackface is intolerable. Therefore, this is all the way out. Or you can talk to Mav and you can get it on a scale.
Yeah. I gave it a 2 out of 10. Yeah. So
is it kind of blackfacey? Yes.
It's kind of a little blackface adjacent. Sure.
But is it the same as problematic blackface?
No.
Not really the same thing.
I don't.
It's like there's nuance to life.
What?
There should be podcasts that talk about this. So we've resolved nothing.
That's your reading of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mav, excuse me. I want them to be black and white and only right and wrong, and that's it.
Well, see, 101 Dalmatians were black and white, and then they ruined it.
Hey, full circle. So we've solved.
We've solved. Anyway,
Moby Dick episode.
I think it's an interesting thing. I think like when Andrew gave it to me, it's like, how have we not just talked about this very idea for an hour before? So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for bringing it.
Yeah,
you could have used this on your show. You've got 2 of them.
Yeah, thanks for coming back, Andrew.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you for having me on.
Yeah.
So you do, I was going to say one of your shows is on hiatus, but it doesn't matter. There's like 300 episodes. So
there's available content for both the Protagonist podcast and for Disney Animation Minute Essentials.
Yes. Where can people find the 2 shows?
Just standard podcast stuff, but we are also part of the Dueling Genre Network. So if you look up Dueling Genre, you should be able to track us down, as well as I'll just plug, a couple dozen other shows that you could listen to. I've actually been really enjoying one of the show's Franchisography has been going through the X-Men films one at a time and talking about things. I think they've actually very delicately threaded some dicey needles about production and directors and stuff. So I recommend that one for some, not too intense, but reasonable discussion of the X-Men franchise. Joe was on to talk about X-Men First Class recently. So that was a lot of fun.
And for those, who've not heard, well, just quickly, Disney Animation Minute Essentials is, I did it right. Oh my God.
You nailed it.
It's Kestra and Andrew go through a different Disney movie 1 minute at a time. As I said in the blog, it is a Herculean task that I cannot imagine doing at all. Particularly, I mean, I've heard other people this basic thing for other shows as well. Nothing against you, even Andrew, but the attention to detail that your wife does. Kestra's amazing.
It's only deepening.
Yeah,
she has done more research for 101 Dalmatians than either of the other ones. She's got a whole bibliography that she'll publish by the end of it.
Yeah, it's astounding too. So the
this
concept
is the
of the show,
humanities that we need in the world,
right?
I think you guys might be intimidated by her bibliography.
I am.
I love it.
Their show is they go. I mean, you go through 1 minute at a time, and let's talk for half an hour to an hour about every minute of this film. So, like they did Little Mermaid. I was on several episodes of their Little Mermaid series. Hannah was on several episodes, and they went through Little Mermaid 1 minute at a time. You know, and each one. So the film's 90 minutes long. So there's 90 episodes, and each one's half an hour. So literally, there's a good 45 more hours worth of content of them talking about this 90-minute movie. It's fascinating.
We have probably worked on that longer than some of the performers worked on that. The voice actors probably didn't have to spend as many hours working.
More than any published scholar on that film.
Yeah, and it is fascinating to listen to. And you guys also did Snow White, and now you're doing coming soon
101 Dalmatians.
Yeah, so
which I'm actually way more excited about than I initially was. Like having watched it a couple times and like learning the history, I'm like, okay, actually, like I'm super into this. Also, guys, if you haven't watched it, like watch 101 Dalmatians and think of it like Taken, because it's basically Taken with dogs.
It is
nice.
I like it.
Nice.
See,
That's great.
And then your other show, Protagonist. Protagonist is, one great story. How's your brother? One great story.
Every week, it's a great character and a great story. So one piece of fiction every week,
and that's basically a book report, an intense book report and close reading based on one character of a novel. Well, not just a novel, television show,
TV show, movie, or comic book, and that is 300 and some odd episodes. I think we're over 350 episodes. We're coming close to 400, and Joe really needs to get a lot of credit for that because it has been consistent week to week. He has been consuming a lot of media for 6 years. At this point, well, 7 years really at this point to keep that going. And it's a lot of stuff, guys. I don't know if he's really tracking it on his CV, but he should.
Yeah. And of course, that's also, for people who enjoy our box office game, you guys are where we stole it from. So,
I don't think we're going to end up with a box office game this year, but maybe next year.
Yeah. Well, we've got ours going and
it's smooth sailing, right? It's going perfectly.
It's going it's going interestingly. I mean,
that's better than last year.
Yeah, we got a good game going now because things are opening up. So I haven't calculated this week with again Snake Eyes has been at it. So, but anyway, thanks again for doing this and thank you for the topic. You. So everybody should check out all of or both of them. All of it. Really, Andrew's on podcast a lot. You should check out the things he mentioned. Katya, what about you?
You can hear. I increasingly don't believe in the internet, so
it's kind of you host the podcast, so we're gonna kind of need you to believe in internets. Internets are important.
I mean, I will believe in the magical recording box insofar as it is helpful.
Wayne,
here mostly.
I hate you, bro.
I honestly feel like the pandemic has burnt me out on the internet. I didn't realize that was possible. I think it's happened.
I hate you guys so very, very much.
I show up for this. I show up for you, Matt.
I know. You can follow me on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, all of the places, always at Chris Maverick. You can follow the show, all those same places at Vox Popcast. You can follow the show's blog at www.voxpopcast.com, where you can find out what we're talking about next. We have a bunch of really cool shows coming up. We got King Arthur. We got narratology and video games. We've got a lot of interesting stuff coming up. So check out our blog. You can leave us comments. You can give us your thoughts. We can address them on the show like we did today. If you enjoy the show, and we certainly hope you do, please subscribe to us on iTunes or Stitcher or Spotify or where the hell else you get podcasts from. And do us a favor, leave us a 5-star review. That helps other people find the show, especially if you leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. And don't just leave us a rating, but if you write a little something that tweaks the algorithms, makes us more popular, gives me something fun to read and engaging, and and then we can do a reading of it on the show. We can read it and we can, what do they really mean by this? Do they really like us? Or are they just trying to shut me up because I keep asking?
No, we need to do that. We need to do dramatic interpretations of iTunes reviews. That needs to happen. Cut this part, but that needs to happen. It's like some kind of anniversary bullshit.
No, this stays. Anyway.
Oh, spoilers.
Anyway, I would like to thank Maximilian of Thought Porn Music for our epic theme song, building ever so more epically and playing us out. I'd like to thank you at home for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye.